There is a story that has lived quietly for generations. Not the kind of story you'll find printed neatly on a museum placard. The kind passed from an elder's voice to a child's ear, carried through prayer, through song, through the quiet conviction of a people who never stopped knowing exactly who they were, even when the rest of the world stopped asking. It is the story of a tribe of Israel, a tribe that did not disappear when history seemed to erase it from the record. A tribe that crossed water most people would have called impossible to cross, and whose descendants, generation after generation, became the builders of one of the most extraordinary civilizations this hemisphere has ever known, the empire the history books call Aztec. Before we go any further, I want you to sit with a question. What would it take for a people to carry their identity across an entire ocean, across centuries, across a total collapse of everything familiar to them, and still remember, generations later, exactly who they were when their descendants finally arrived somewhere new? That question is the spine of everything you are about to hear. This is not the kind of proof a courtroom asks for. It is something older than that. A memory folded into ceremony, a pattern repeating in structure and symbol, a feeling passed down from a grandmother's hand resting on a grandchild's shoulder, saying, "Remember where we came from, remember who scattered us, and remember that the scattering itself was never meant to be the end of the story." Tradition holds that among the tribes driven from their homeland, one carried its journey further than any of the others, not simply east into the deserts most history books describe, not north into empires that kept careful records of who they conquered, west, across water, into a hemisphere that history would later claim to have found for the very first time. Stay with me through this, because there are 3 moments ahead where something extraordinary happens. 3 moments where the people carrying this memory looked at the civilization rising around their own descendants and recognized something, the way you recognize a face in a crowd you were never expecting to see again. By the end, you may find yourself looking at the empire the world calls Aztec a little differently. And if you carry the name Israelite, if your family has always taught you that the story of the 12 tribes belongs to you, and not only to the pages of an old book on somebody else's shelf, then what follows is your story too. Not told as a checklist of coincidences, told the way it was always meant to be told, as a saga. To understand how this saga begins, we have to go back to a promise. Long before ships, long before anyone standing on either side of the earth could have imagined an ocean separating 2 enormous continents, a promise was spoken over the children of Israel. It said that if they were ever scattered, they would not simply be pushed into the next valley or resettled in the next kingdom over. They would be scattered further than that, all the way to the far corners of the world, to places their own ancestors could never have pictured in their minds. For most of history, that promise has been treated as poetry, a dramatic way of describing exile and nothing more. But tradition remembers it as something closer to a map, a pattern laid down long before the actual scattering began. And one by one, tribe by tribe, that pattern played out across deserts, across mountain ranges, across seas that swallowed entire fleets. Most of the 12 tribes' stories went the way the history books already describe: displacement, slow absorption into the peoples around them, disappearance from written record, even if never fully from memory. But this saga follows the one tribe whose road did not stop at any coastline anyone was expecting. Tradition names this tribe the House of Dan. Among the 12, Dan carried a reputation unlike the others: restless, skilled on water in a way that made the neighboring tribes uneasy, more at home near a coastline than tied permanently to one plot of land. There's an old fragment of poetry, one of the oldest pieces of verse preserved from that entire era, that asks a strange question almost in passing. It asks why Dan lingered by the ships. Not why Dan went to war like the others, why Dan remained near the water. For thousands of years, that single line has puzzled readers. A tribe with no coastline of real significance being asked, almost accusingly, why they stayed near their vessels instead of joining the fight on land. Ask yourself that question the way people have asked it for centuries. Why does an inland tribe need ships at all? What did the house of Dan know or plan that the other tribes did not? This saga answers that question the way it has been carried forward, not with the kind of certainty a historian would sign their name to, with memory, with the kind of certainty a people carry when the alternative is losing themselves entirely. When the kingdom that held the 12 tribes together finally broke apart, worn down by war from without and betrayal from within, most of the tribes waited. They stayed, hoping the storm would pass, hoping the next generation might rebuild what the last one had lost. The house of Dan did not wait. They had already spent generations near their ships, generations learning currents, learning the temperament of the open water, learning how far a vessel could travel before the crew ran out of anything to eat. When the moment came that staying meant disappearing entirely into a conquering empire, the house of Dan made a choice that would take their descendants further from home than any of their kin would ever travel. They loaded their ships, and they went west. Picture the night they left. Not a triumphant departure, a desperate one. Firelight along a coastline, women wrapping bread and dried fish into cloth by lamplight, men driving nails into hulls that had been prepared for months but were still, by any honest measure, not ready for what was coming. There was an elder among them named Zimri, a man who had spent 40 years reading the currents the way another man might read a familiar road. It was Zimri who gave the order to load the last of the grain. It was Zimri's daughter, Tamar, who carried her infant son wrapped tightly against a storm that had not even started yet, because she had been told the crossing might take longer than any of them wanted to admit out loud. Nobody on that shore that night believed they were making history. They believed they were surviving. The first weeks at sea were the easy part, if anything about that journey could be called easy. Familiar coastline, familiar stars, a crew that still, for a little while, believed home was something they could return to if the winds turned against them. Then came the point of no return, the moment when the coastline they knew disappeared behind them for good, and the only thing ahead was open water, further than any of their maps, if they even had maps, had ever attempted to describe. This is where the saga stops being about tribes and prophecies for a moment and becomes about people, about a mother named Tamar, rationing milk for a child too young to understand why the world had turned to nothing but water and wood, about sailors who had grown up believing the sea ended somewhere reasonable, now facing weeks with no proof that it ended anywhere at all, about an old man, Zimri, standing at the stern each night, doing the only thing he had left to offer his people, watching the stars, trusting a pattern he had trusted his entire life, even when every instinct told him the pattern might finally be wrong. There were losses. Tradition does not pretend otherwise. A storm in the middle months took 2 of the smaller vessels entirely, along with everyone aboard them. Sickness took more, slowly, the kind of illness that spreads through cramped, salt-soaked wooden hulls when there is not enough clean water to go around. Grief became as constant as the tide. Every family on that crossing buried someone at sea long before they ever saw new land, and every family kept going anyway because turning back was no longer a choice the ocean was offering them. Ask yourself honestly what kind of conviction it takes to keep a ship moving forward after you have buried people you love in water with no shore in sight. That is the conviction this saga asks you to sit with, not admiration for a myth, respect for the kind of endurance that does not make it into most textbooks because it left behind no written record, only descendants, only memory, only a pattern that would resurface unmistakably on the other side of that ocean. Months into the crossing, the winds shifted in a way Zimri had been waiting for without ever saying so out loud. Birds appeared where no birds should have been, far from any coastline anyone aboard could name. Then, on a morning nobody aboard would ever forget for the rest of their lives, a green line appeared where there had only ever been water. Land. Nobody cheered right away. Tradition says the first sound that crossed those decks was not celebration, it was silence, and then weeping, the kind that comes from people who had stopped letting themselves hope somewhere around the 3rd month at sea. Tamar is remembered as the first to step into the shallow water, her son on her hip, testing the ground. You test something you no longer fully trust to be real. Zimri, the old man who had watched the stars every night of that crossing, is said to have knelt in the wet sand for a long time before he said a single word to anyone. What he finally said, according to what has been carried forward, was not a claim of triumph. It was simpler than that. He said they had been sent, not lost, and that the ones who did not survive the crossing were not left behind by accident, and that whatever waited for them past the tree line, they would meet it as the people they had always been, not as strangers erasing themselves to fit somewhere new. They did not know, of course, what they had found. No name existed yet in their language for the vast new world stretching out in front of them. Thick forest, unfamiliar animals, mountains rising in shapes none of them had ever climbed before, and people already living there, people who had called this land home for longer than anyone on those battered ships could imagine. The House of Dan did not arrive as conquerors, they arrived as survivors. And for a generation or more, survival was the entire story. Learning what could be eaten, learning which rivers could be trusted, learning slowly and often painfully how to live inside a landscape that owed them nothing. But something remarkable happened as the years passed, and then as the decades passed, and then as an entire generation who had never seen the old world grew up knowing nothing but this new one. They did not simply blend in and disappear. Certain things persisted. Not everything, not even most things, but enough that when their descendants, generations later, began to build something larger, something unmistakable rose to the surface. This is the first recognition moment. As the settlement grew into something closer to a true community, a particular class of person emerged among them. Caretakers of ritual, keepers of purity laws around what could be eaten and what could not, around who could enter certain spaces and who could not, around ceremonies tied to the turning of seasons and the passing of years. And when this community eventually began constructing something more permanent, more monumental, they did not build low, wide temples spread flat across the ground. They built up, great stepped structures rising toward the sky in stacked, ascending platforms, with a sacred chamber waiting at the very top, closer to heaven than any other point in the settlement. A structure whose entire purpose was elevation, access to the divine understood quite literally as height. If you have ever stood at the base of a Mesoamerican pyramid and felt something unexpectedly familiar in its shape, you are not the first. because a structure built for a divine encounter, reached by ascending steps, tended by a dedicated priestly caste, governing purity and ritual, was not a foreign concept to the descendants of the House of Dan. It was an echo, a pattern remembered in stone, even generations after the people who once knew its original meaning had passed away. The second recognition moment came later, as the community grew large enough to need real structure, real governance, a way to organize thousands of people who could no longer function as a single extended family. They divided themselves, not randomly, and not in the way most growing settlements simply split by geography or convenience. They organized into 12 distinct groups, each with its own leadership, its own responsibilities, its own place within the larger whole, all of them still understanding themselves as one people beneath that division, a structure of 12 governing one. For a people descended from 12 tribes who had once stood together beneath one kingdom before everything broke apart, that number was never just a number. And the third recognition moment is, in many ways, the most striking of all, because it does not come from anything the House of Dan brought with them. It comes from a legend told independently by the people history would eventually call the Aztec themselves. Their own oral tradition describes an origin point across water, a distant homeland called Aztlan, a place their ancestors departed from generations before founding the great city that would one day stand where Mexico City stands today. A place of islands reached by crossing water, left behind for reasons their own legends describe only in fragments. Historians still debate what Aztlan actually was and where, if anywhere, it could be located on a map. But sit with the shape of that legend for a moment. A people whose own foundational story insists their ancestors crossed water from a distant homeland before becoming who they eventually became. Ask yourself, what are the odds that a scattered tribe, carrying its own crossing story for generations, would settle among a people whose own oral tradition remembers a nearly identical shape of departure and arrival? This saga does not ask you to accept coincidence as proof. It asks you to notice the pattern, because patterns, repeated enough times in enough independent places, stop being purely accidental and start becoming something closer to memory, refusing to fully disappear. Generations passed. The community that began as exhausted survivors on an unfamiliar shore became something almost unrecognizable from where it started. Cities rose, trade routes stretched for hundreds of miles, farming systems fed populations far larger than anything the original House of Dan crossing could have supported on its own. By the time the empire reached its height, the people who eventually called themselves Mexica, and who history would remember as Aztec, commanded one of the most sophisticated civilizations anywhere on Earth at that time. Massive causeways connected island cities to the mainland. Engineers built systems to manage water most modern cities would still struggle to replicate. Astronomers tracked the sky with a precision that still impresses researchers who study it today. At its peak, this was not a scattered people clinging to survival anymore. This was an empire. And then it fell. Not slowly, the way some empires decline over centuries, quickly, violently. Foreign ships arrived from across an entirely different ocean, carrying weapons, disease, and ambitions of conquest the empire had no framework for anticipating. Within a few devastating years, the great city at the empire's heart was reduced to rubble, its temples torn down, its records burned, its people scattered, enslaved, or forced into silence about who they had been before conquest arrived. Sit with that for a moment, because history rarely lines up this neatly, and yet here it does. A people descended from a tribe that had once been scattered from their homeland by war and betrayal, who crossed an ocean to survive, who built something extraordinary out of nothing, watched that new civilization fall the exact same way, conquered by outsiders, their temples destroyed, their records erased or rewritten by the people who defeated them, their descendants forced to carry their true history quietly, privately, the way a people learns to carry something too dangerous to say out loud where the wrong ears might hear it. If exile was the beginning of this saga, exile also marks its second chapter, and that is, in its own painful way, one more echo, one more pattern too precise to be entirely coincidental. For centuries afterward, the descendants of that empire, and the descendants scattered among them carrying older blood than even they fully understood, lived under conquest, their languages suppressed, their ceremonies driven underground or reshaped to survive beneath a new ruling religion, their true names, the ones that connected them back across an ocean to a homeland most of them had never even heard mentioned aloud, buried so deep beneath generations of forced silence that entire family lines lost track of exactly what they had lost. But losing track of something is not the same as it disappearing entirely. Memory has a way of surviving underneath silence far longer than anyone forcing that silence ever expects. A grandmother's insistence on certain foods and certain avoidances that made no sense to outsiders. A family's quiet unwillingness to fully adopt every custom pressed onto them by conquerors. A feeling passed down without full explanation that their story did not begin with conquest and would not end with it either. That feeling is what eventually resurfaces, not as proof a courtroom would accept, as recognition. The same kind of recognition this saga has been describing from the very beginning, a pattern too persistent across too many generations to be nothing at all. So where does that leave us all these centuries later? It leaves us with a question this entire saga was built to ask, not necessarily to answer with the kind of certainty that closes a case file forever. What do you do when a memory this old, this specific, this consistently repeated across independent, unconnected traditions keeps resurfacing no matter how many empires tried to bury it? You could dismiss it as coincidence, plenty of people have and will continue to. Or you could sit with the pattern this saga has asked you to sit with from the very beginning, a prophecy of scattering to the furthest corners of the earth, a tribe with an unusual, almost suspicious relationship to ships and open water, a crossing story carried forward generation after generation, even as the details of exactly which ocean, exactly which century faded, the way all oral memory eventually fades without written record to anchor it. A civilization arising an ocean away from ancient Israel, with a priestly caste, a structure of 12, and a founding legend of its own that remembers a crossing from a distant homeland almost impossible to distinguish from the very story that got the house of Dan there in the first place. And then, devastatingly, a second scattering, a second conquest, a second forced silence, echoing the first one so closely it is almost impossible not to notice. This is not a story asking you to abandon what mainstream history teaches about the rise and fall of the Aztec Empire. It is a story asking you to consider what mainstream history has never fully been able to explain, where certain patterns came from, why certain structures echo older ones from an entirely different part of the world, why a civilization thousands of miles across open ocean from ancient Israel would organize itself into 12 governing divisions, build ritual life around ascending, elevated temples tended by a dedicated priestly class, and preserve a founding legend of ancestors crossing water from a distant homeland, almost impossible to distinguish from the very story that got the House of Dan there in the first place. If you are watching this because you already carry the name Israelite, because your family has always taught you that the story of the 12 tribes did not end where most textbooks ended, then perhaps none of this feels like a stretch to you at all. Perhaps it feels instead like confirmation of something you were raised already knowing in your bones, long before you ever heard the word Aztec used the way this video has used it.
The scattering was real. The promise that it would reach the ends of the earth was not simply poetry, and every pattern this saga has traced across an entire ocean, across a civilization that rose and fell the same devastating way the homeland once did, is one more thread connecting a people to a heritage that conquest, silence, and centuries of forced forgetting were never fully able to erase. You are still here. Your story is still being told. And if there is one thing this saga wants you to carry with you long after this video ends, it is this: being scattered to the ends of the earth was never a punishment that erased who you are. It was always, from the very beginning, part of a much older promise that your ancestors would still be found, standing, remembering exactly where they were always meant to be scattered to. If this story moved something in you, say so. Tell me in the comments which of the 3 recognition moments struck you the hardest: the temple, the 12, or the crossing legend itself. And if you want the next chapter in this saga, the story of what happened to these descendants after conquest, after silence, after centuries of forced forgetting, stay close, because that story is still waiting to be told, too.